Okay, so this is the second part of the exam feedback for the evolution of the living Earth exam. So this is part D, the biogeochemical cycles questions. So if you're looking for part B, the global environmental change, there's another video for that, which you should be able to find somewhere on the internet, YouTube or Learn. Okay, so looking quickly at the I guess some general advice. I guess this is repeated in the other video as well, but there are some instructions on the front of all of the exam papers you'll do university. Do please read those instructions. They will help you get more marks than not reading them, I guess. So just to reiterate, for this exam, there are 8 questions, but you only have to answer 6 of them. So you effectively choose 2 questions which you don't have to answer. But the instructions on the front of the exam state that you also have the requirement that you have to answer 1 question from each of the 4 sections. There's some restriction on which 2 questions effectively you choose not to answer. And I guess also make sure that you read the question carefully to make sure that you really understand what it's asking you. And we'll go through some examples of kind of decoding or rewriting the question in your own words, which is a good practice to do when revising as well as during the exam, to kind of really narrow down on what the specific question is being asked. Okay, so we'll go through some of these things as we go. So again, here's the mark distribution for the whole exam. So some people did very well, some people not so well, but overall a good performance, and hopefully these videos will help you understand what you have missed out on to get from the blue into the green zone, or from the red zone to the blue zone, or even the green zone. Gonna aim for the stars, if not just the right hand side of Mark's graphs. So here are the 2 questions for the last parts, question 7 and question 8. As you can see, a very broad spread of marks for all of them, and we're going to have hopefully be able to identify some of the places where marks were dropped across these questions. So we'll start off with question 7. So looking at the actual question here, this is a question all about carbon in the ocean, and specifically dissolved inorganic carbon. So again, you might have lost a few marks if you spent a lot of time focusing your answer on carbon, including organic carbon, but this question is about inorganic carbon. Okay. So the first part, we'll just have a look here. So what are the approximate relative proportions of the chemical species that make up total dissolved inorganic carbon? I guess by implication in the ocean, because this is an ocean. So I guess rewriting that a question kind of I guess more obviously, first part of it really is what are the different forms of carbon that make up the dick, and what then for are their relative abundances. Okay, so that's really what the question is asking. Shouldn't be too difficult. It's only requiring a short answer here, only 10% of the overall mark. And these are the kind of slides from the lecture course which should be kind of coming to your the front of your memory at these points. So if we have a look here, we've got the equations of the dissolution of CO2 in when it reacts with water, forms carbonic acid, bicarbonate ion, and the carbonate ion. And this is a graph here showing their relative proportions. So low pH, we have largely aqueous CO2. High pH, we have largely carbonate ion. But at the pH of the ocean, which is about 8.1, we have these kind of approximate proportions here. So we have CO2 makes up about 1% of the DIC, 90% is bicarbonate ion, and 9% roughly is the carbonate ion. And only a very, very tiny amount is this carbonic acid. It's a very unstable molecule. Okay, so this list here, okay, these proportions would have got you most of the marks for this question. So I think quite a lot of people got that, which was good. Next, kind of, I guess, question or part of the question is just asking you to draw a typical concentration profile of dick in the ocean. So this is what I was looking for. Pretty sure this is one of the figures from one of the slides. So the important features we are kind of really looking for here is having at least some kind of label on the axes, depth and dissolved inorganic carbon, and hopefully some kind of sensible depth scale. From zero at the surface down to some kind of sensible depth for the ocean. The numbers on the dissolved inorganic carbon axis here, I'm not that worried that you know the exact numbers. But what really is important is that there is the value at the surface doesn't go to zero at all. Okay, so we've actually got compared to the amount of variance or the difference between zero and the surface concentration, in this case about 2,000 micromoles per kilogram, is huge compared to the amount of variability. Okay, we've only got 250 micromoles. So if we're looking at about 10% kind of variability of the overall concentration within this profile. So the important thing is that the concentration in the surface is low, increases with depth, and then is relatively constant in the deep ocean, but it does not go to zero. So the axis doesn't go to zero. So these are the important things we're looking at. It might also be nice to have some representation of the pycnocline, thermocline, whatever you want to define it, or however you think that the mixed surface layer of the ocean is separate from the deep ocean. But overall, I mean, this would have been good to see. Which, yeah, so concentration profile. Boom, get that, do it. Okay, so part C, what determines the amount of dick in the ocean? So here, again, the question is quite, simply worded, but can we rewrite this again in our own words, thinking about maybe we could split this up into what are the processes that determine the amount of DIC in the ocean, what are the conditions that can determine how much dissolved inorganic carbon can be in the ocean. So again, this is maybe somewhere where people might have missed out on some marks because they focused entirely on conditions and ignored the processes, or vice versa. So let's just have a quick look at some of these things. So the conditions. So I think quite a lot of people got it in their answer. The temperature of the surface of the ocean is very important. It's important that you're referring to the temperature at which carbon dioxide can exchange with between the atmosphere and the ocean. So it's the temperature of the surface part of the ocean that is important because that determines the solubility of CO2 in water. So at lower temperatures we have a higher solubility, and that's kind of shown here and is kind of reflected by. Okay, so that determines how much CO2 can go into the ocean, but we also need to consider how much of that CO2 actually gets converted into the other forms of carbon, because the bicarbonate and the carbonate ions are really important for how much carbon we can store in the ocean, because those are chemical species which don't interact with the atmosphere. They have no gaseous form. So that's kind of this graph kind of over here from the lectures, which is basically showing the kind of amount of DIC that we can store in the ocean at different pHs if kind of everything else, if the atmospheric concentration and temperature are fixed. And this basically shows that at higher pHs, as we have preferentially more bicarbonate and carbonate ions compared to the CO2, we can actually store much more carbon in the ocean. So two things here, the temperature and the pH are really important conditions which determine how much DIC we can store in the ocean. So those would have been two good things to explain, as well as kind of like make a list of the conditions, temperature, pH, that would have got you some marks, but some explanation of how those things actually determines how much DIC can be in the ocean would also have been good. Okay, so let's all look at some processes as well. And one of the factors that can determine increase or decrease the amount of DIC in the ocean is really this difference between the surface concentration and the deep ocean concentration. So the surface concentration is largely determined by the exchange with the atmosphere, and the pH of the ocean to determine how much DIC can be stored in that water. But the largest part of the ocean by volume is the deep ocean. Okay, so if we can increase the difference between the surface and the deep ocean, we can basically store more carbon in the deep ocean than would be kind of its equivalent if it was just at the surface. Then that can allow us to store more carbon in the ocean overall. So what are these processes? Well, they're these basically processes here that transfer carbon between the surface ocean and the deep ocean. So these are ocean mixing. Okay, so the more that the ocean mixes, the faster deep water upwells to the surface, the faster the overturning circulation, the less this difference will be. Okay, so we're constantly moving this stuff back to the surface. And countering that, what's basically moving carbon from the surface down to the deep ocean are these carbon pumps, these kind of organic and inorganic carbon pumps. So think about those as well and how they affect the amount of DIC in the ocean. Okay, and that's leading in to I guess the last part D. What processes operate within the ocean that actually lead to the surface DIC concentration being different from the deep ocean? So why is the deep ocean got a higher concentration of DIC than the surface ocean? So again, looking at the ocean circulation, one of the reasons why this water down here has got a higher DIC concentration is because this water that's filling up the deep ocean, this is ultimately being derived from surface water from high latitudes, first around Antarctica, forming Antarctic bottom water and Antarctic intermediate water, and around Greenland, Iceland, water sinks down and forms North Atlantic deep water. Now these deep water masses fill up large parts of the ocean basins, and they are very cold. And they were very cold when they were last in contact with the atmosphere. So they have basically gathered more CO2 from the atmosphere, so their DIC will be higher. So they're higher content in the deep ocean than the surface ocean, because the deep ocean was last in equilibrium with the atmosphere when it was colder. But then also we have this transfer of carbon from the surface ocean to the deep ocean by organic and inorganic carbon pumps. Okay, so this is where organic matter in the surface ocean takes up carbon by photosynthesis and then moving through the food chain, and that forms organic carbon which sinks down to the ocean, and then in the deep ocean it's respired, released back to CO2, which then goes back into the DIC. We have a similar effect going on with, I guess, inorganic carbon production. So this is plankton and other animals that grow shells or tests, and that takes DIC out of the surface ocean to produce a calcium carbonate shell, and that then falls into the deep ocean as well. Okay, so we've got, I guess that wasn't really covered much in the lecture, but really what I was looking for here was this organic carbon pump. So we're taking up organic matter and then we're respiring it back out in the deep ocean. Okay, this slide shouldn't be here, so we'll ignore that. That was from our previous year's questions. That was an error. So anyway, so I think quite a lot of people got most parts of this question, did very well. Those that didn't do so well in this this question largely did so because they missed out on either whole sections of the question. So that's another good way of not doing well in an exam. If a question's got 4 parts and you don't answer all 4 parts of the question, that's a very good way of not getting the marks. But also missing out on parts of some of the questions and only answer in kind of 1/2 of a part of the question would have not been ideal. Okay, so moving on now and having a look at the last question on exam, question 8. So this was a question all about phosphorus and the phosphorus cycle. Again, a large spread of marks, so some people did well. In this case, slightly fewer people did well than those that did badly. It's raining very heavily outside my office, which is, I guess, typical for this time of year, which is awesome. Anyway, so looking at the question now again in a number of parts, roughly equal weighting to all the parts, some slightly more than the others. So not looking for huge long answers for parts of these, but at least something a little bit more substantial than a simple list. So the first part: why is phosphorus essential for the functioning of all organisms? I think one of the key words that was missed out on by quite a few people here was the all. So quite a lot of people wrote, I guess quite correctly, that phosphorus is essential element or nutrient element for things to grow bones or have teeth, but not all organisms require bones and or teeth. So while it was correct, got some credit for it, it wasn't really what we're looking for. What we're really looking for is like, what are the parts of cells, because all organisms have cells, what parts of cells are made of phosphorus or require phosphorus for them to exist, and then also what processes require those molecules for a cell to operate. So looking back to some of the lecture slides, so some of the parts of cells, so DNA, the kind of the these. Oh no, that's not what I wanted to do. Let's not do that. Oh, it's crazy. Yeah, so the backbone of DNA here, you can see, requires a little phosphorus atom for that to work. So without phosphorus, we wouldn't have DNA, and that's kind of essential. There are also phosphorus in proteins, enzymes, that kind of things. Also, cell walls. All the cell walls are made of phospholipids. So without phosphorus, we wouldn't have any cell walls. So it's really, without phosphorus, I guess basically cells wouldn't exist at all, and without phosphorus, the parts of cells also wouldn't be, or the key parts of cells wouldn't be at all. Also, we mentioned a little bit in the lectures the function of these two molecules here, this adenosine diphosphate and adenosine triphosphate. These are essential molecules for the transfer of energy around cells. So you can see that they are quite phosphorus-rich molecules. So each of these, I guess this one's got 2 phosphoruses, this one's got 3 phosphoruses on. Without phosphorus, these things couldn't function, wouldn't work. So bad things would happen. So next part of the question: how does pH control the bioavailability of phosphorus in the environment? Think about how you might phrase that slightly differently. You might think about what are the chemical reactions that can kind of bind phosphorus or react with freely available phosphorus in the environment, and then with those chemical reactions show how they are dependent on pH. Thinking about figures from the lectures that are relevant to this question, hopefully this would be something that should be memorable, and you have remembered. And that's oh no, go backwards. Looking at a graph of pH in soils against basically the different flavors of phosphorus, or the different environments or chemical bonding environments of these phosphoruses. So at low pHs down here, most of the phosphorus is bound onto oxides of iron and aluminium, hydrated oxides of aluminium. Some phosphorus might be bonded to clay minerals, roughly similar proportion at all pHs. But then at high pHs, phosphorus tends not to be bound in these iron aluminium phases and is bound more strongly on calcium and magnesium phases. The overall effect of that is this available phosphorus as kind of soluble phosphate that organisms could take up is low at low and at high pH, but is more available at moderate pH. Okay, so that would be a good thing to have in your answer, and you could have gone into some more detail here to explain kind of how different forms of phosphorus can kind of exist at different pHs. Okay, so at low pHs we might have more phosphoric acid and dihydrogen phosphate, whereas at high pHs we might have more phosphate and hydrogen phosphate. And then that links into how available these kind of forms of phosphorus are, because these forms of phosphorus will react with calcium to form a variety of different calcium phosphates. And the higher the pH, the less soluble those calcium phosphates tend to be. So at low pH, we might form some calcium phosphate that's relatively easy to redissolve, but then at high pHs, those calcium phosphates become more and more kind of difficult to redissolve again, making the phosphorus less bioavailable. So in addition to that, we could also look at the iron as well, and how iron bonds to or iron oxides help bind away phosphorus. Anyway, moving on to the next part. Again, this is kind of a little bit of a list kind of answers. Basically asking what are the sources and how is phosphorus removed. So we're specifically looking for the sources of phosphorus to the ocean. Okay, so we're looking for basically fluxes into this box here. So if you were to write an answer about phosphorus being derived from weathering, I guess that is kind of technically correct. So phosphorus is kind of released from the lithosphere into the rest, or certainly into the terrestrial kind of soil environment by weathering, but that doesn't release it into the ocean. Okay? It will eventually get into the ocean, but the key things we're looking for is how does it get, what are the last steps of getting into the ocean. So the important things are that some is transported by dust, some by rivers, and also I guess it would be, as well as just pointing that out, it would be worth pointing out that when phosphorus enters the ocean by rivers, quite a lot of it is kind of rapidly removed. Okay, only a small fraction of that enters by rivers actually really makes it into the ocean proper. Most of it gets lost to these calcium magnesium phases, as the pH rises from kind of the neutral pH of river water to the slightly kind of basic pH of the ocean, about 8. Okay, so we've got, I guess, just looking at pictures for answers. So I guess we've got a source from dust, and I guess you could go into a little bit more detail here to get some more marks by saying that actually it's the iron coatings on dust grains that is thought to contain most of the phosphorus that actually ends up dissolving in the ocean from the dust. Quite a lot of the phosphorus that enters by rivers is lost to sediments in the estuaries, as I kind of mentioned. And then the last part of the question, how is it removed from the ocean? It's removed by basically the deposition of organic matter. So organic matter contains some phosphorus because it's essential for kind of all of the cells. So when something that's made of cells dies and falls to the bottom of the ocean, it'll take some phosphorus with it. And phosphorus can be particularly enriched by kind of sedimentary deposits of things that are particularly rich in phosphorus. So things like layers of fish teeth or layers of layers of bones. Okay, so we might have deposits like that remove a lot of phosphorus directly from the ocean. We might also have phosphorus being removed by birds. So birds will be eating organic matter produced in the ocean in the form of fish, and they'll be carrying that phosphorus inside them. They fly over land and they deposit phosphorus in phosphorus deposits of bird poop. Okay, so the last part of the last question of the last question of the exam. In most of the surface ocean, phosphorus has a very low concentration. That's a statement, it's not a question. So the question is, why is this? So why is the surface concentration of phosphorus very low? And why are there some areas in the ocean where the concentration is higher? So we can look at a little map of this. So this is a map of the surface concentration of phosphorus, and you can see that large parts of the ocean away from land, we have very, very low concentrations, almost zero. But there are some areas of the ocean, so in the Southern Ocean, and we can also see in some places of the west coast of equatorial Africa here, of the coast of Namibia, the coast of South America. We do have higher concentrations in the Arabian Sea here. We have slightly higher concentrations. So I guess the first question is, what why is the concentration low? So I guess we could expand on that and write the question in a different way by just saying what processes lower the surface concentration of phosphorus. Okay? So that's effectively saying why is this? Why is the concentration low? What processes? So we're looking for an explanation of the mechanisms which are redistributing the phosphorus within the ocean. And then we want to think about why these regions around coasts or in the Southern Ocean, what could be causing this to be kind of somewhat different? What's maybe stopping the removal processes, or is it not a stopping of the removal? Is there an oversupply of phosphorus? Okay. So the process that removes phosphorus from the surface ocean, that's kind of the production of organic matter. So primary productivity, photosynthesis. When we produce that organic matter, that requires some phosphate in the surface ocean to be converted into phosphorus-bound organic matter, and that will maybe be returned to the water when that organic material kind of breaks down and is respired. But if that organic matter sinks out of the surface ocean before it can be kind of redissolved back into the ocean, then that will remove phosphorus from the surface. Okay? So you might want to think about what might stop this happening. Okay. Ooh, back we go. What might stop this happening? So if there's anything that limits the amount of primary productivity, that might mean that we can't use up all of the available phosphorus in the surface layer of the ocean. So it could be that maybe at high latitudes, north and south, it might be too dark for there to be all of the photosynthesis that could happen depending on the nutrient availability. Or it could be that there's another nutrient that's missing. So life doesn't require just one nutrient like phosphorus, it requires other nutrients like nitrate, maybe potassium, and other elements. And there are also some elements like iron, which are essential for life, which don't really exist or aren't at very high concentrations in places like the Southern Ocean. So this means that photosynthesis can't occur because it's running out of one nutrient, so all of the other nutrients can't be completely used up. So this is called nutrient limitation. I'll be looking for that in the answer. And that might explain why some of these regions have got high concentrations of phosphorus, because they're just not being used up because life is being limited by something else. But in some of the other regions, particularly around kind of coastlines here, where we might have strong upwelling of deep water, where water's being brought from the deep, where it's got a very high phosphorus concentration, been brought to the surface, and it just hasn't had time to be removed yet. So this is kind of like an oversupply kind of indicator. Okay, so those are the things we were looking for. You could have gone into describe those processes in some detail to get kind of full credit. But yeah, so here were the marks. Hopefully, if you were one of the red people, hopefully now you can see where you might have picked up some more marks to become a blue person or even a green person, which is what you want. Which is what everyone wants, to be a green person. Yeah, so hopefully you found this useful and or interesting, or at least useful. I guess maybe not the best way to spend an evening listening to some exam feedback, but hey, you know, some people like that kind of thing. Right, so I'm gonna stop now. I might just go. Bye bye. Enjoy the feedback, or if you feed forward if you're using this for revision, which you should do. So yeah, good job, well done. We stop now.